Welcome back. This three-part presentation is a look at the implications of the Chinese cruise that circumnavigated Australia in early 2025. It is part of a larger series providing what I call the long, slow look at major issues impacting Australian strategic policy. These presentations are made well after the triggering event to take advantage of additional information as it becomes available. I'm also trying to avoid the knee-jerk reactions that happen during the event, and I am also trying to keep clear of the politics, but sometimes it simply can't be avoided. The cruise is, to me, absolutely fascinating. It is one of those rare real-world events that, in peacetime, enables us to see how two sides view any potential conflict and how their operational strategies interact. Finally, note that I'm going to refer to the PLAN circumnavigation of Australia as simply the Chinese cruise, or even just as the cruise. There are always multiple views of any significant event such as the Chinese cruise. In these presentations, I am only going to look at two viewpoints, that of Australia's and that of China's. The Chinese regime didn't decide on a whim to just send a few ships on a cruise around Australia. They were sending multiple messages that these presentations will attempt to unpack. The other view, the Australian view, is actually far more difficult to decipher. This is because our response is far more influenced by ideology than China's, and institutionally, we seem unwilling to listen to what the Chinese are telling us. Now, we have to go back just a little before we can go on. In April 2023, Australia adopted a strategy of denial following the Defence Strategic Review, better known as the DSR. The DSR and subsequent reviews implemented a Defence Force structure as well as the planning of procurement and logistical pipelines to create an ADF that could implement the strategy. Note that for simplicity's sake, as well as for protecting my voice, all of these elements will come under the generic title of DSR. The DSR itself used four core concepts, or pillars, as an ideological base to explain its implementation. The cruise had tremendous implications for these pillars. These pillars determined what was needed to implement the DSR. Nearly 3 years later, they are best described as promises. Core requirements remain a decade, even decades away. These include the AUKUS and Virginia submarines, the Australian-built GP frigates, the stillborn LOSVs, and, of course, the urgent need stated in the DSR for the development of the RAAF's bare bases that remain mysteriously still bare. Even the promised HIMARS that will be the backbone of the Army strike component remained largely undelivered. The Chinese cruise obviously happened well before any of these promises will be met. That does not, on its own, invalidate the DSR in any way, shape or form. That's very much a different discussion. The real question the cruise raises is whether the ADF we have now, and up until the promises are delivered, mitigates the implied threats identified by the Chinese cruise. Trying to make that assessment is the purpose of these presentations. Now, before I start, I would like to do something that was often overlooked in earlier discussions in the media, and that is to thank the men and women who went out there to monitor the cruise, some with little warning, and who did so despite the impact upon their families. On this occasion, it was both Australians and New Zealanders crewing their frigates, as well as the aircrew of both countries' Poseidons. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion the Royal Australian Navy's small boats were also involved, largely thanks to this unattributed photo released by Defence of the Chinese frigate transiting the Torres Strait. Please note that nothing in the following discussion is aimed at any of the ships or the plane's crews, but it is quite depressing that our own defences, given their cost and despite the efforts of its rank and file, seem almost irrelevant. Now, in discussing the impact of the Chinese cruise, I am going to talk a great deal about the four pillars that underpin the DSR. Three of these four pillars are the control of the air and maritime approaches to Australia, ensuring a hostile power does not obtain bases to our north, and changing the ADF from a balanced to a focused force. However, in discussing the relevance of these pillars, I will often leave out the fourth one, but that's simply because I can't spend the time constantly referring to it. So I will start and end with me saying that the only pillar of note under the DSR is the alliance with America. And even then, the DSR downplays it by throwing other countries into the mix. Japan and the UK are not allies in the stricter sense. Our relationship with both is more one of technological access and defence procurement. Far more important than either the UK or Japan is how we manage the alliance with America as a junior partner. In terms of mitigating any military threat under the DSR, the real questions are how committed America is to the alliance and, perhaps far more importantly, how committed China actually believes America to be. This makes America the most important determining factor in what type of military action against Australia that China's leaders will believe will benefit their regime. I would like to quickly comment on the relevance of my book to this cruise. In it, I looked at why and in what form Chinese aggression against Australia would take. At the end of the book, I put it all together in a scenario, and its introduction matched what we have just witnessed. Either the Chinese are reading my book, in which case I will at last earn some royalties, or the far more likely reason for the cruise is that my assessment of the drivers of China's strategic policy is correct. This may well create the progression that I present in my book, and especially in that scenario. I am desperately hopeful that I am utterly and completely wrong. Only time will tell. Please also note that in my earlier presentation on why China is a military threat, I stated that a major invasion of Australia is extremely unlikely without a significant change in the strategic balance in the West Pacific, although arguably such a change is slowly happening. However, in the interim, the Chinese preference is for some type of raid against what it perceives as weak links in the American system of bilateral alliances. The aim is to gain both international, but especially domestic propaganda advantage. The cruise should be viewed as part of China's increasing ability to conduct a variety of raids, whether they are so-called grey zone warfare or outright military strikes against targets of its choice. Another note for our New Zealand friends. In earlier presentations, I was asked to include New Zealand in any analysis. I did originally discuss the impact of the cruise on New Zealand's strategic policy in great depth, but I've removed it for two reasons. Firstly, it added tremendously to the length of these presentations, but mostly because I am doing a presentation specifically on New Zealand's strategic policy a little bit later. Finally, we should really take heart in remembering our cruises are much better than this Chinese one. They had no swimming pools, no deck chairs, no games of trivia, and absolutely no stage musicals. Hopefully, they also found the waters to our south an absolute misery. Still, having said that, it's now our turn to perhaps get a bit miserable. This is a map from, of all places, America's Newsweek magazine. It shows that there was considerable American interest in the actual technical achievement the cruise represented. How we responded, both politically and militarily, was also closely observed by our only real ally. Now we'll get into the nitty-gritty. I am going to refer to this map showing the radar coverage of the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, or JORN, fairly often. JORN's coverage shows the primary focus of the ADF. When we look at the cruise, it becomes evident that JORN's coverage was almost irrelevant. However, JORN is the RAAF's baby, while the Chinese cruise, to state the obvious, is a naval problem. Interestingly, the Navy had no control over the assets that performed either the best or the worst during the cruise, and some of its own assets were almost irrelevant. Let's start off by looking at the Collins-class submarines. When you only have 1 or 2 boats available, at most, this is where they are going to patrol. It's why they are all based at HMAS Stirling. Conventional submarines are the great ambush predator of the world's oceans, and operating on their batteries are far stealthier than their nuclear-powered big brothers. Like a death adder hiding under the leaves on the forest floor, they are extremely difficult to spot, and if a target comes within range, the result is almost always fatal. However, like a death adder, they're too slow to keep up with an unhurt opponent. The more boats you have in the water, the more area they can cover, but we have too few available. Once the Chinese frigate transited their patrol areas and headed east, the crew of any Collins-class submarine may as well have been in rubber boats. It doesn't mean the Collins cannot operate on the east coast. It's just that there is a lack of facilities, and it would take weeks to sail to the Coral Sea from its base in the west. It would take even longer if there is the possibility of a Chinese submarine lurking in the area. So our submarine service is not designed for quick reactions due to naval developments nearly 2,500 kilometres away on the other side of the continent. There is also no point. The Coral Sea alone covers nearly 5 million square kilometres, and the 2 entry points into the Coral Sea that were used during the cruise were themselves about 1,500 kilometres apart. We would need an additional fleet of 6 boats based in the east at facilities promised but still not existing to have the minimum permanent presence needed for the Coral Sea. This was the point Hugh White was making when he recommended dramatically increasing the number of our submarines. The lack of any threat by Australian submarines allowed the Chinese ships greater freedom of operation, and it allows them greater freedom of operation not just in peacetime exercises such as this, but also in time of war or near war. What do I mean by this? There was speculation that a Chinese submarine accompanied the cruise. Personally, just due to their current submarine numbers and the purpose of the cruise, I thought this highly unlikely and in fact almost nil. However, over the next few years, the massive Chinese submarine build program will give them the boat numbers, while we still will not have any to threaten their ships. Our surface ships, operating on the possibility that there is a Chinese submarine in the area, will have their speed and area of operations restricted by the need to conduct ASW, even if it's just in case. Meanwhile, superior Chinese reconnaissance, especially satellite and intelligence assets, will enable them to know just how many Australian ships and submarines are at sea and the maximum distance they could have sailed since leaving port. As an aside, an AUKUS submarine or a Virginia could have kept up with the Chinese. However, it's not that a nuclear-powered submarine is better, it is that they have different roles. Still, the Chinese crews highlighted the weakness of a small conventional submarine fleet resulting from the immense geographic scale to our north. I'll now have a quick look at the Navy's small ships. The Royal Australian Navy has a one-size-fits-all policy towards its patrol craft. Ignoring their lack of weaponry, or whether they are the best type of craft for the Torres Strait, or even the fact they probably couldn't keep up with the Chinese frigate for any prolonged period of time, it's their lack of sensors that is the problem. None carry any long-range drones for reconnaissance. None obviously carry helicopters. Arguably, there is a reason for these absences, notably the RAAF Poseidons and of course JORN. As you can see, the frigate's transit was mostly in JORN's area of coverage. However, that coverage ended just as the frigate reached the areas of greatest danger for major Australian strategic sites. Meanwhile, the much more powerful Chinese cruiser passed from JORN's coverage well before it turned south and neared Bougainville. I'll talk a bit more about Bougainville later, it's really quite interesting. By the way, this is an updated map of JORN's coverage with the implementation of Phase 6, which is scheduled for final operational capability by the end of 2025. It is also one of the few defence projects that hasn't been torn to shreds by the NAO, so full credit to this project team. Obviously, and quite correctly, much of JORN's capabilities are kept secret. Just as obviously, the Chinese will be attempting to get as much specific detail on JORN as possible. And let's be honest, there are wide enough gates for them to drive their intelligence agencies' trucks through. In terms of security, the sale of this kit to Canada is a bit of a concern. Additionally, the Chinese will have access to the same technology that was developed by the Soviets, as well as now having the scientific and technical skills to at least understand JORN's strengths and weaknesses. How the crews split, the routes taken, and where they rejoined shows the Chinese are either extremely lucky or else have a pretty good understanding of JORN's capabilities. While I have an interest in JORN, I do not pretend to be an expert. I've double-checked the following as much as possible using open source material. The first point is that JORN is highly vulnerable to disturbances of the ionosphere. JORN can be compromised by space weather, as an example sunspots, lightning and storms, dusk and dawn, and even just night. This vulnerability is reduced by technological innovations, and Australian scientific teams have reportedly done some very impressive work. However, although JORN is designed to reach up to 10 degrees south of the equator, the simple reality is that volatility in the ionosphere increases 20 degrees north or south of the equator. The darker area on the map is where this volatility has the greatest impact. In the right conditions, JORN's range increases quite dramatically, but in bad conditions, it loses effectiveness. The potential loss of effectiveness is one of the reasons 3 emitters cover the waters to Australia's northwest. It is also why coverage is weaker for those areas only covered by 1 or 2 emitters. Also note that JORN detects movement towards or away from the emitter. Detecting movement that maintains a constant distance from the emitter is much more difficult, though, as always, it's a bit more nuanced. I'll talk about this later in the presentation. Unlike line-of-sight radars, subject to the upgrades, it is almost impossible for JORN to identify the altitude of an aircraft. This means that alternate radar platforms, such as the RAAF's Wedgetails, are needed to provide accurate targeting information. As impressive as it is, JORN is not a be-all and end-all radar solution. However, and this is very important, stealth technology is seriously ineffective against JORN. This significantly reduces the advantages of China's advanced aircraft. There are unconfirmed reports that JORN even tracked an American F-117 that was attempting to circumnavigate the world undetected in one of their exercises. If true, it's not that JORN succeeded, it's that the Americans thought it wouldn't. More importantly, the ability to track stealth aircraft must change the nature of any threat to Australia. That's a whole different discussion, although it is a very interesting one. On the flip side, its effectiveness against stealth aircraft encourages the major powers to develop means of reducing the effectiveness of similar radar systems to JORN. There are perhaps 4 technological avenues, plus a couple of more mundane options, to at least temporarily reduce its effectiveness. Rather interestingly for this discussion on the cruise, JORN cannot pick up objects as small as a cruise missile. However, and this is quite fascinating, the speed of hypersonic missiles that basically tear a whopping great big wound in the atmosphere enables JORN to track them. So, time for one of my little detours that relates directly to JORN's performance. On the 8th of March 2014, Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 went missing. The approximate time of crash was roughly between 0800 and 0830 Perth time. Before going on, I wish to apologise to anybody who watches this presentation who lost loved ones or friends in this disaster. It is not my intent to seem heartless at this tragic loss of life. However, My interest stems from the latest searches for the passenger jet. They provide one of the few publicly available examples of the effectiveness of JORN. These are the search zones undertaken in the Indian Ocean in late March and April 2014. What is interesting is how much of these search areas were actually covered by JORN. I've overlaid the publicly acknowledged reign of JORN to show that coverage. As Australian taxpayers footed a large amount of the cost of these searches, there was little point conducting them in these areas if JORN's coverage was strong enough to track a passenger jet. If JORN was incapable of tracking one of the world's largest aircraft, resulting in the need for searching these areas, then there is a serious problem. And this brings into question the single emitter's coverage of Australian waters to both the northeast and to the west. There are clearly reasons why JORN should have been able to track this flight. It was one of the largest passenger jets. It is widely believed to have flown in a fairly level flight, largely towards the transmitter. Space weather records for that day indicate disruptions to the ionosphere were negligible. And finally, the lack of debris suggests the plane did not abruptly plunge into the sea. Equally, factors working against JORN tracking the flight were that the search area was covered by a single emitter. The aircraft would have entered JORN's range in the early hours. Dawn would have caused disturbances in the ionosphere that reduced JORN's effectiveness. And, ignoring space weather, the actual weather in this region in March is notoriously bad. Widespread lightning causes serious local disruptions to the ionosphere. There are potential reasons for the Australian government to believe JORN could not have detected the passenger jet. They were that JORN was not providing 24-hour coverage, although Defence states it does. That the emitter had no depth in its equipment to allow continuous operations during maintenance. This left it completely offline for, at a minimum, several hours. This would have been quite the coincidence. Alternatively, the Australian government may have declined to provide the information in order to protect JORN's capabilities. I have to say that this is absurd, as the only information we would have released is that JORN was operating as publicly expected. Are these reasons realistic? Personally, I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, and I've usually found the obvious answer is the most likely. 4 years after this tragedy, there was a $1 billion upgrade for JORN. Given the chaotic nature of Australian politics in those years and the glacial pace of defence acquisitions, this timeline fits the notion that JORN was incapable of tracking a large passenger jet due to the conditions back then, and that this tragedy identified a serious weakness. The upgrade obviously addresses these issues, but until the next test, Australians in general will not know how much it improved JORN's coverage. JORN, of course, was not alone in monitoring the Chinese crews. We also have the RAAF Poseidons. Jumping back to the crews, what is interesting is that the Poseidons seemed stretched when the Chinese crews split in two, with the frigate sailing through the Torres Strait and the larger ships sailing to the north of New Guinea. Defence released photographs of the crews to the north of PNG from the 10th to the 12th of February, and they were obviously taken from Poseidons. But none of the single Chinese frigate while it approached or exited the Torres Strait. Quite simply, if you don't have enough resources, you allocate what you have to the most important target. And this is what seems to have happened in those early days of the cruise. There was no choice but to deploy the available Poseidons to keep the northernmost ships under surveillance, especially as it was the first to move out of JORN's area of coverage. What the Chinese also would have noticed during the early days of the cruise as they transited to the north and south of New Guinea is our first great failure. And that failure was the incredibly expensive Triton drone. At that time, Defence simply kept this failure hidden from the Australian public. The first drone we have received had, at the time of the Chinese cruise, been flying for nearly 3 years. It was put into service by the RAAF nearly 8 months before the cruise, but was still not operational, and it is unclear when that will actually happen. Its survivability during any conflict is so low as to be comedic, but it should have had a major role during peacetime. Yet, during the Chinese cruise, after nearly 10 years, well over $2 billion, with another $1 billion yet to be spent, the RAAF Triton remained in its hangar. Honestly, I think the Triton's failure would have even surprised the Chinese. However, it didn't surprise me or anyone else who has followed the saga of this appalling defence acquisition. Still, ignoring the woeful Triton, any defence force is not only about its personnel and weaponry, it's also about the strategic policy that determines how it is used. Yet, by this stage of the Chinese cruise, there were some other quite remarkable developments, and these all relate to the pillars of the DSR that I discussed previously. The first pillar, originally developed by Paul Dibb, remains integral to the DSR. It is controlling the maritime and air approaches to Australia. Firstly, any country that developed the capability to become a military threat to Australia would also have developed armed forces using 21st century technological and logistical capabilities. This means they can project naval power vast distances from their bases. Yes, logistics are much easier if there are major port facilities nearby, but from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, American ships have routinely operated thousands of kilometers away from any major naval base. This ability provides options. The Americans are especially outstanding at using task forces to punish any opponent without the need for committing ground forces. The cruise showed that the Chinese have now developed that same capability. So, how does the DSR go about defending the maritime approaches? The first thing you need is the ability to find an enemy force. As discussed, JORN needs multiple emitters to cover the same area in order to greatly increase the chances of detection as well as detail of any target. The triple coverage in the northwest clearly shows this region is the prime focus of our defence planning. The secondary region of strong coverage is the southern coast of New Guinea, but only by 2 emitters. Having coverage by only 1 emitter is not a disaster as such, but it is a serious weakness. Note the real problem. The demographic heartland and what little military production we have is focused in the southeast, as is all our major sea lines of communication in the event of conflict. Having spotted the threat, you need the ability to engage and destroy it. You can again see the emphasis in our defensive planning by the placement of RAAF Tyndall and the Bear bases for the forward deployment of the RAAF F-35s and Super Hornets. It's a classic concept of concentrating your air and naval forces to defeat an amphibious threat. The problem is that's not the way the Chinese will threaten us. That is, at least, until the Taiwan issue is resolved. Quite simply, the cruise didn't play where we wanted it to play. In doing so, it started and ended with the same message, and it is one that was almost completely ignored in any analysis during those first few weeks. You may remember that at the beginning of this presentation, I noted it was just as fascinating where the cruise did not sail as much as where it did. The diversion of the frigate to the south of New Guinea was a signal that China now has the ability to sail their ships in areas important to Australia, such as the Torres Strait, just as we have sailed our ships in the South China Sea conducting freedom of navigation operations. There are clear differences, and to a great extent, this transit diverted attention from China's main message. And that message was delivered by the fact that, accepting the detour by the frigate, the Chinese cruise did not, at any time, sail in the maritime areas that are the primary focus under the DSR. This was a clear strategic warning to our defence and political leadership that China did not have to play by our rules should they wish to apply military threats or actions against Australia. The Chinese were also quite happy to show us how they could apply those threats, and I'll talk about this in further detail. Now, this is incredibly important. The Chinese use and will continue to use overt military action to change a country's domestic and international positions. The likelihood of them doing so is dependent upon the victim's weaknesses, hence the maritime focus on the Philippines. Equally, if Australia's defensive capabilities are unable to counter this military pressure, then the more likely it is for the Australian government to be forced to appease. This lack of coverage is why the Chinese cruise, in terms of maritime surveillance and strike capability, was such a shock. While we were able to assume the Chinese would have to approach from the northwest, JORN provided Australia with a tremendous advantage. Once the Chinese developed, and they always were going to develop, the capability to bypass this choke point, the advantage was largely lost. From this point on, and for the next 3 weeks, coverage was limited to Poseidons and the aged and overworked Anzac frigates. During this part of the cruise, all of our Poseidons each would have had to undertake a minimum of 3 sorties, provided their endurance was extended by not carrying weapons and that none were out of service for maintenance or upgrades. Therefore, it was almost certainly more sorties per plane. Due to the continental distances involved, the RAAF strike aircraft were almost completely irrelevant during this entire cruise. I'll discuss this more in part 2. There was subsequent media speculation about extending JORN's coverage to the east. It is of little benefit. Firstly, it would still only consist of a single emitter with its limitations. If the emitter is built in Australia, the Chinese ships will still be maintaining their distance from any emitter, significantly reducing its effectiveness. Interestingly, an emitter in New Zealand makes life a little harder for the Chinese crews. Secondly, there is a problem of detecting ships and aircraft the further south they travel. Just as near the equator, convulsions in the ionosphere do increase as you go further south, as do the frequencies of storms and lightning. The point where the Chinese conducted a live firing exercise was really quite dramatic for this reason. Even in the best of conditions, JORN would not have detected the live firing exercise of the ship's guns, or even the launching and tracking of cruise missiles. That's not its role, and it's also not the point. Still, the Chinese at this point were literally saying that we're here and we can do anything we want because we've just bypassed billions of dollars of your land-based sensors, your submarines, and your drones. Conceptually, under the DSR, the emphasis is on defeating a major invasion force. Of course, a major invasion is a huge undertaking, and as I've said repeatedly, this is very unlikely in the near term. It's also not the Chinese way of war, nor is it even conceivable prior to the fall of Taiwan and assessing the losses the Chinese Navy may have suffered. Perhaps after Taiwan's fall, we will have to prepare for that eventuality, but until then, we must be ready for any alternatives. The cruise showed that we are far from ready for the alternatives, such as already used by America or even the United Kingdom. What we call pinpoint or targeted attacks are little more than the modern versions of the gunboat diplomacy of the last 2 centuries. During the reign of Victoria, if the British didn't like how the natives were behaving, you sent in the Royal Navy, lobbed a few shells or landed submarines, all to convince them to behave. Nowadays, you have a submarine launch a couple of tons of high explosives or a long-range drone that can carry up to 100 smaller suicide drones. A more accurate definition of all these events is raiding. A modern Chinese task force, even without an aircraft carrier, has surface ships whose ground attack missiles can hit targets with pinpoint accuracy over 1,000 kilometers away as per this map. Even a relatively small task force would have enough firepower to overwhelm the defences on the eastern seaboard, inflict massive damage, and probably have enough reserve firepower and distance to escape with little, if any, casualties. More importantly, Chinese submarines are now being built with their own vertical launch systems, and they carry the Chinese equivalent of our Tomahawks. This makes them the modern raider's choice. as not only can a submarine inflict massive damage, they also have an excellent chance of survival. Strategically, the drumbeat sounded by the Chinese ship's cannons was far less important than the location. China's strategic culture starts with warnings, then leads to raids, both violent and non-violent, in order to force a lesser power to conform. When they chose that location, the Chinese were deliberately announcing they could simultaneously hit, without warning, Australia's most important strategic assets, ranging from Amberley in the north to HQ JOC near Canberra, and perhaps most importantly, Williamtown. And I'll discuss this Williamtown in greater detail in part 2. And the risk is increasing dramatically. At the beginning of this decade, the Chinese only had 6 older style nuclear attack submarines, but they had already commenced a massive building program. By 2030, the year of decision over Taiwan, the Chinese Navy will have about 25 nuclear-powered submarines, plus the largest and most modern conventional submarine fleet in the world. The Chinese shipbuilding capacity is such that the Americans are forecasting that, by 2035, China will have a nuclear-powered submarine force of all types approaching 80 boats. Excluding both sides' boomers, this is a graphic display of relative submarine forces in 2030. The number of Chinese nuclear-powered submarines that are actually on par with the Virginias are roughly half the number the United States Navy will have in 2030, but the Americans must cover 3 oceans. The United States Navy between now and then will be lucky to receive 5 Virginias. Even then, each Virginia received will see the retirement of an LA-class boat. In terms of tracking submarines, way back during the Cold War and in the relatively smaller waters of the North Atlantic, NATO developed a highly effective detection system. America and Japan have now applied an improved version of that submarine detection system based around the first island chain. However, once beyond the first island chain, this ability quickly diminishes due to a lack of sensors, too few ASW aircraft, and, perhaps more importantly, that the United States Navy cannot afford to use their LA-class boats to track individual submarines as they did in the Cold War. There is just not enough of them, and the ones that remain are facing obsolescence. Meanwhile, the Virginias with their VLS have become far too important as a strike weapon to be wasted tracking individual Chinese submarines. A complicating factor, an extremely complicating factor, is the ambivalent attitude of the countries to our north, especially Indonesia. The fact is that once outside the South and East China Seas, Chinese submarines can traverse vast expanses of water largely safe from detection. That means submarines do not have to approach Australia from the northwest, and we do not have enough Poseidons to cover 2 oceans. The really interesting aspect of controlling the approaches to Australia is, as I noted in a much earlier presentation, Indonesia. China is a major investor in its economy and has a fair degree of influence. Diplomatically, while China and Australia only have observer status within ASEAN, Indonesia partners with China as a member of the BRICS group, and some of those members are really quite interesting. Bluntly, for Indonesia, the memories of Australian involvement with Timor's successful independence are still there, as is a religious and ethnic undertone in our relationship. Indonesia also strongly objects to the AUKUS submarines, and that is a very important point to remember. To the northwest of Australia, Indonesia is a wild card. Would they inform Australia if they located Chinese submarines transiting their waters? Would the Indonesians refuse such transit, or that of surface ships, in a more serious situation? Would they even want to? Perhaps, most importantly, would they allow our ships and planes to operate in their territory? Now, those questions are actually getting a little bit more interesting. This presentation was held up once more, pending details on the recent security agreement announced between Indonesia and Australia. Despite press releases, it seems largely to be an agreement for consultation between the 2 countries. Indonesia is certainly not turning its back on its relationship with China, and it's hard to see under what circumstances it would be willing to risk that relationship. This treaty and the one signed with Papua New Guinea will probably be the focus of a later presentation once more detail is known, but the detail itself is only being eked out very, very slowly at this time. What this means is that in any future crisis, a Chinese naval force can sail entirely within Indonesian territorial waters using the right of innocent passage. Depending on where it enters international waters, it would be within missile range of RAAF Tyndall and at least one of the RAAF's spare bases. This is not a minor consideration, with tremendous political and diplomatic repercussions for any action Australia could possibly take to prevent this happening. Assessing how Indonesia will behave is largely absent from any discussion, mostly because it's better not to think about it. The logic of controlling the air and maritime approaches to Australia appears self-evident, but there are too many wildcards, and the Chinese capabilities are far too great for Australia to realistically keep any Chinese threat either at a distance or in the locale that we would prefer, which means the first pillar is a mistake. This then brings us to the hollowness of the second pillar, ensuring that a hostile power does not obtain bases to our north. Before we look at the other Pacific wildcards, we need to understand how they are created. In my book and earlier presentations, I have repeatedly noted that, concurrent with any major industrial expansion, there will also occur a massive expansion of a country's financial sector. The industrialization of China over the last 3 decades was extraordinary, and so too was the development of its financial sector. In a totalitarian state, just as for its growing industrial production, the increasing wealth becomes available for the pursuit of its regional and global objectives. China is proving no different to any totalitarian government that has come before. However, compared to those earlier examples, the scale of the amount of money China is willing to throw around, not just for each country it targets, but for buying the support of individual politicians, is simply incredible. In our region, Chinese aid is second to Australia and only just above America's. Chinese infrastructure investments, such as this wharf in Vanuatu, are often dual use. They are also implemented with, shall I say, weak governance. Others reinforce prestige, such as the Presidential Palace in Vanuatu. This building is on an obscene scale for the size and wealth of Vanuatu. Australian aid is now also increasingly focused on infrastructure, but without the kickbacks. To my mind, the switch to infrastructure development is a mistake. Providing emergency food supplies, health clinics, schools, even scholarships, all under the Australian flag, makes a far bigger personal impact, but on a wider scale, than playing China's game. China's aid, however, is also changing quite dramatically. It is moving from infrastructure to grants. China is now more overtly buying political support through direct donations to questionable institutions such as the Solomon Islands Constituency Development Funds and Kiribati's Social Stability Fund. There is a reason Kiribati's politicians scream loudly about Australia's impact on global warming, but remain silent on China's. Also note how cheap is the overall cost of buying influence in the Pacific. Grants in the Pacific barely cost China $100 million per year, but they are achieving some remarkable results. This article defines the relationship between the family of Solomon Islands' former Prime Minister, who signed the security agreement with China, and who is currently the country's finance minister. His son is a 40% shareholder in this somewhat mysterious construct. I discuss Sagavi in my book, and as an example of what will continue to happen as China openly throws money around. He is the most well-known, but not the only seriously corrupt politician in the Pacific, who always puts his pockets before the welfare of his own people. The funding relationship between China, the Solomon Islands ruling our party, and the Sagavi clan is really quite interesting. It's pretty clear this is simply a bribery pipeline from China. the mysterious Mr. Pan had previously set up another shell company whose business activity was equally mysterious, called Solomon Islands PackSafe, way back in 2019. Now, in this later incarnation, in addition to Sagavi's son, one of the more interesting shareholders, also at 40%, is the Solomon Islands police minister. This is a portfolio that is becoming the primary focus of China throughout the Pacific. In a funny way, the cruise highlighted many of the problems within the second pillar. But I'm actually going to start with an agency that is almost always left out of discussions about Australian strategic planning, despite its vital importance. At the beginning of the cruise, it seems to have failed completely in its primary task. It's also an agency about whom we seemingly do not wish to discuss either whether it has failed or the implications of failure. The agency, of course, is the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. This may be unfair, as by definition, its activities must largely remain secret. However, you can assess its performance by what happens in the region. The following is a little detour focusing on Papua New Guinea. Before I start, there is an interesting aside to this discussion, and that, like Indonesia, is of course the recent defence treaty that was not signed, but then finally signed between Australia and Papua New Guinea. I had written a discussion on this treaty into this presentation, which created both another delay and greatly expanded its length. However, it also does not fit into my aim of not including any gut reaction and waiting till more information is available. Bluntly, there is certainly much more detail to come. I've therefore stripped it out of this presentation and will return to it in a later one. The question now is whether it invalidates the following section. I do not believe so, as I am trying to highlight the natural advantages the Chinese intelligence agencies have and the disadvantages that ours face. Papua New Guinea's foreign minister during the Chinese cruise is quite an interesting character. He has shown a remarkable flexibility in his political alignment, and as foreign minister, this is his second bite of the cherry. He was first forced to resign following Papua New Guinea's 2023 delegation to the coronation of King Charles III. Papua New Guinea sent some 30 delegates and guests, one of whom was his daughter. Each delegate received government funding of about $20,000, but it is unclear if that included his daughter, who famously in Papua New Guinea put up photos on social media showing her going to high-end boutique shops during this trip. Once the scandal broke, there were denials that she actually bought anything, and to be fair, her father has become quite wealthy in his own right. Wildly, after the scandal broke, he called those fellow countrymen who were upset over the expense and waste primitive animals. Despite this statement, he was to subsequently argue he was simply misunderstood. In the aftermath of the Chinese cruise, he was to state in an interview that he knew of the Chinese cruise some weeks before it actually happened. Subsequently, following media reports that created some embarrassment for the Australian government, he denied that was what he meant and again said he was just misunderstood. He then stated that he only knew of the cruise when Australia told him a few days before it happened. I've attached a link to the interview and you can decide for yourself. If the Chinese wanted to announce the cruise in this way, then why would they tell a Papua New Guinean politician or senior official? It all boils down to conceit, pride and influence. Flattery is an important spycraft tool. Not as important as money, but still important. The local Chinese intelligence service would also push the theme of look how powerful we've become and how pathetic is the Australian response. Flattery reinforces the effectiveness of another very worrying aspect of Chinese influence in Papua New Guinea, but one that is very important and rarely discussed in Australia. The following is taken from the ANU's Department of Pacific Affairs. I'll include this in the references. It provides the following anecdotes. In one coastal city, the electoral administration processes that should collect PNG citizens' enrolments, safeguard this data and communicate it to polling stations often fail. Voters are turned away, sometimes in large numbers. In one area of the Highland, ballot boxes were hijacked by political gangs and then filled in secret. They were then protected by armed men. In some cases, competing gangs raided each other's ballot boxes, destroying them. People died in the fighting. In those locations in which voters were able to cast ballots, they were often pre-marked, or they voted under the supervision of candidates and their agents. This is some more rather depressing data on the breakdown of electoral process in Papua New Guinea. VM stands for voting methods. There are two areas of significant concern. The first is the region of its capital, Port Moresby. There, 4 out of 10 people who voted were not identified on any electoral roll. Worse, the Highlands holds half of Papua New Guinea's population. In the Highlands, control of voting at 10% of the polling booths collapsed completely, while voting at over half of all booths was controlled by representatives of the candidates or local leaders, local tribal leaders, or even criminal bosses. Roughly, about 1 in 3 votes cast in Papua New Guinea were either potentially fraudulent or else subject to varying intensities of intimidation and vote buying. Equally, a large number of eligible voters were denied their rights. Obviously, China can and does use this chaotic system to buy influence relatively cheaply in a large number of electorates. In comparison, Australian attempts at influence, such as the $500 million spent on a football team, are over-expensive and the kickbacks are over-concentrated. How much does it cost to buy an electorate? That's a lot harder to say. Is it $100,000 or $1 million per annum, or somewhere in between? Is it lower for criminal gangs, higher for local bosses who control regions, and even higher for politicians? Remember, you don't have to buy every electorate, just enough to ensure you retain enough control to obtain your preferred outcomes. Is it 10 out of 89 electorates, plus 2 governors, or double that? At the top of the range, that would work out at around $20 million a year, or only about a third of the annual cost of the football team Australia is funding. It's quite impressive, really. In terms of the Chinese intelligence budget, that amount barely counts as petty cash. Still, politicians and bureaucratic pockets are deep. Just because you favour one side doesn't stop you providing information to another for a price. And we do not seem to have the money going into the right wallets. There is just enough evidence to indicate that the ASIS failed, and if it did fail, it was in the most strategically important country to our north, and on the only occasion in the last 50 years it had to succeed. To be fair, while the agency does have a role in counterintelligence, it is beyond its remit to directly intervene in Papua New Guinea's electoral process, nor do I believe it should. For that, we may have to look at private security companies. It cannot be emphasised enough just how fragile are several of the island states to the northeast of Australia. Chinese intimidation and bribery is widespread, and apart from the Solomon Islands, you should add successful Chinese pressure on Kiribati, the Cook Islands that are to the east of Fiji, Vanuatu with its Chinese-built dual-purpose dock, and the Federated States of Micronesia, of which I used as an example in my book. China's resources are such that our diplomats and aid agencies face an unequal struggle to combat the impact of Chinese corruption and straight-out intimidation. Worse, this pillar remains reliant upon one of our so-called whole-of-government responses. In other words, it is not funded by, nor the responsibility of defence, but DFAT. So the cruise shows yet another agency is clearly failing according to the needs of our strategic policy. But, in all fairness, DFAT was always going to fail. The lack of public discussion prevents implementing alternatives, such as different covert or overt agencies, with the later perhaps being private security companies engaging in more aggressive activities, just as China is doing. My personal opinion is that we have to be careful that we don't breach our own standards, which are the standards we hope to develop in these failing democracies. We should provide protection from intimidation for politicians who are standing up to China, and support them with clearly defined and publicly accountable funding. However, in the end, China will succeed in many of these countries, and we need to prepare for that eventuality. We can no longer pretend that simply writing our preferred outcome for the region in the DSR will actually create that reality. So what is the relevance of all this for the crews? There are two results for the ASIS based on whether PNG government or some of its officials knew details of the cruise. Either no one knew anything, in which case there is largely no problem. However, if any PNG official did know at least some detail and the ASIS failed to obtain this information, then this is a truly serious issue. PNG officials may not have known specifics, but they would have been dealing with Chinese government representatives or representatives masquerading as businessmen in Chinese state-owned companies, and they would be spreading the word to highlight China's power. It's difficult to see, given its dual path around the north and south of New Guinea and its transit close to Bougainville, that the cruise was anything else but direct messaging for PNG. They were saying our ships are here, but not the Australians nor the Americans. There seems no point giving this message if the Chinese ships were reliant upon Australia passing the information on to PNG officials. In fact, Australia not being able to inform PNG until a few days before the Chinese transited the Torres Strait, and perhaps more importantly, travelling north along the New Guinea coast before entering the Coral Sea, was a propaganda victory in its own right. The Chinese intelligence services are very good, and they would clearly not have wasted the opportunities presented by this cruise, and that means contact to spread the message. It's what I would have done, and I dare say any competent intelligence service in the world would have done the same. As I've said previously, although ASIS's actions must be shrouded in secrecy, their performance can be assessed by what happens in our region. On this occasion, it is not just the cruise, but also the quite substantial success of Chinese influence in Papua New Guinea that shouts failure. And, as usual, at a budget of over $500 million per annum, it is not an Australian agency run on the cheap. Then there is a truly serious wildcard to our north, and one we largely ignore. I have found very little information on the island of Bougainville, and I've been watching out for any information for some time. At present, Bougainville is moving towards independence from PNG in 2027, just a little over a year away. Once again, governance is very weak. There appears to be a long-standing and quite understandable resentment towards Australia over the operation of its infamous Australian-owned and run copper mine. Also, perhaps more importantly, was the Australian involvement in suppressing the rebellion against PNG's government. The PNG Army allegedly committed vicious reprisals that led to upwards of 20,000 deaths, or a shocking 5 to 10% of the population. Bougainville's independence, probably long overdue and subject to constant delays by PNG, is the ideal situation for exploitation by China, and is foolish to think they are not making a play for it. It is too early to see how the newly elected government of Bougainville, still focused on independence, will view the new defence treaty between PNG and Australia. It's not unreasonable, given the history of our involvement in Bougainville, for this treaty to have created a great deal of unease and for them to increasingly look for a major sponsor. 2 pillars down, and the Chinese had not even travelled as far south as the New South Wales and Queensland border. Yet, before I continue with the cruise further south, I can't ignore the failure of the Australian Army. This is a little unfair, as the Australian Army has become the underfunded, superfluous and increasingly comedic sidekick to the other branches. The Army lacked its own long-range drones for monitoring the cruise as it sailed past, and potentially threatened its only significant combat force. Its much heralded, but still largely non-existent, strike elements remained in their barracks nearly 3,000 kilometres away, far beyond the current and proposed ranges of its missiles. In reality, the only time the Army strike elements see the light of day is for photo opportunities. The Army staying locked in place was always going to happen, as without prior planning and committed transport, the Army strike elements could never keep up with the crews, because naval units can move around the continent faster and with greater flexibility than the existing professional Army can ever achieve. The range of the Army strike elements on a continental scale are so limited that they are almost useless outside of the northwest. It's the hidden secret behind those flashy media announcements about new missile launches. It's also why the Chinese cruise was such a shock. The cruise has shown that the reduction in the actual strength of the Army, and what is best described as a pivot to the north, is proving a disaster. The reduction in the Army has led to the concentration of manpower and equipment in the isolated location of Townsville. It is reliant upon limited road and rail networks, with only one major road and railway line running north-south and a single railway track running to the west. It also has a very fragile aviation infrastructure that is totally reliant upon a joint RAAF and civilian airfield. At this time, there is no intention nor finance to harden the airfield. While the Army's disposition had some validity a decade ago, I find it somewhat distressing that we needed this cruise to apparently realise that the Chinese would inevitably develop the capability to disrupt, even temporarily, our ability to move our major Army unit by air, rail, or even road. Frankly, the ADF's much vaunted amphibious capabilities verges on suicide around Townsville. No major units of the Royal Australian Navy Surface Fleet or the submarine fleet is co-located there. The Navy's mine countermeasure capabilities are now, following the disaster that is the OPV, virtually non-existent. You have to ask, under what circumstances would the Navy be willing to risk its amphibious ships after a punitive attack on Townsville? And how long would it take before it had the ships and aircraft in place before it would even be willing to take that risk? I'm going to be brutally honest. Under the DSR, the location of 3rd Brigade in Townsville makes little sense. After the Chinese cruise, something that was always going to happen as China moved towards a blue water navy, it goes from little sense to bugger all sense. Townsville is extremely vulnerable to a punitive attack. Of all the strategic sites in Australia, the risks to Chinese surface ships that launched an attack from 1,000 kilometres to north of Townsville are almost non-existent. This is because the range for a RAAF strike at about 3,000 kilometres and growing each hour is simply too great. Townsville is outside of the operational range of fighter aircraft operating from either Tyndall or Amberley to provide air defence. Even if tankers are in place for in-flight refuelling and F-35s are on standby, the distance is such that they could not arrive in time, which means that the RAAF would need to have tankers in place and commit enough aircraft to maintain permanent air cover if a Chinese task force is operating in the Coral Sea during a period of heightened tension. The Royal Australian Navy surface and submarine fleets are based even further away and incapable of intervening. The Chinese crews showed that they can sail outside of JORN's coverage. Even once the cruise missiles enter JORN's coverage, they are too small to be picked up. So, again, as I noted, the Army has no long-range reconnaissance capabilities or drones to track a Chinese task force. Therefore, it would be reliant upon RAAF Poseidons and the ADF's substandard communication network to receive an actionable warning. So I'll discuss that more in part 3. But all up, in total, it means that Townsville is effectively defenceless against air attack. There are actually also serious issues within Townsville as well. There is minimal infrastructure to protect both soldiers and equipment. There are minimal emergency medical services that are themselves highly vulnerable. There is an over-reliance upon Queensland Health Services for treating severe trauma. And there is an overburdening of Queensland Health Service due to potential civilian casualties. And as something I've gone on about before, there is Civil defence simply does not exist. Under the DSR, the Army's role is to pivot to the northwest, or, in the right circumstances, to the island countries to the north. The question is, how does it get there? Let's be honest. If 3rd Brigade was to advance under its own power to anywhere within Australia, then the most suitable location is Darwin or at least Adelaide. If it was reliant upon air transport, then the most suitable location is southeast Queensland or the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. If it was reliant upon naval transport, then the most logical location is with Fleet West, which means southwest and Western Australia. The Australian Army in its current form is the baby of Pillar 3, and Pillar 3 is about having a focused force. Yet you need to focus on the correct threat. The DSR is completely focused on defending Australia from a traditional amphibious threat from the north. It is simply not providing Australia with the ability to focus on multiple asymmetric threats. It's almost as though our planners are stuck in the 1960s and simply do not try to mitigate the potential threats that have arisen when China moved from a third world economy to becoming one of the most wealthy, technologically and industrially advanced countries in the world. I've discussed in my book and earlier presentation China's strategic culture. Bluntly, they have a much better understanding of the use of military action to influence, if not devastate, an adversary's ability to withstand Chinese political pressure. Just as America and Britain have repeatedly shown in the Middle East, quite limited strikes can have a disproportionate impact. The Chinese crews proved they now have that capability, which means that, under the ADF structure imposed by the DSR, Pillar 3 also effectively collapsed. Due to length, I'm going to break up the presentation here. In part 2, I'm going to look at the RAAF and ask if it is capable of managing the multiple threat scenarios raised by the crews. In part 3, I'm going to look at what the crew showed about the Royal Australian Navy, along with the fact that the response to the crews raised serious questions about the leadership of the Australian Defence Force. Finally, as usual, I'm going to look at how the alternate strategy of attrition stood up in the face of the crews. Now, thank you very much for staying with me, and I hope you find parts 2 and 3 interesting as well.